Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. Today, we're going to talk about Star Trek Picard Season 1, Episode 8. The title of it is Broken Pieces, and this episode was really good. So far, the only episode that I've really felt has gone a little bit sideways has been Stardust City Rag. And I get them wanting to put in a playful episode. It was just a little bit too playful for me in some ways. But overall, I loved it for really giving us a great reintroduction to 7 of 9 and where she is at this point. And that becomes relevant as we get into episode 8. So there's a lot going on so far. They've covered a ton in the past 7 episodes. They've covered the existence and use of the artifact by the Romulans. They've juggled where Picard is right now. They've introduced and developed Elnor, Soji, Captain Rios, Rafi. We've seen what's going on with Troy and Riker. And we also have the Raiders in here, as well as the Zhat Vash and the Kawat Malat. So there's a ton going on, y'all. And that is totally okay, because they have the timing for the show nailed down pretty well, in my opinion. This is no season 7 of Game of Thrones. Everything in here is very well timed, and they do a lot of work in showing, not telling. So you don't really feel like you're being beaten over the head with any of this information, at least in my opinion. So I'm really liking where they're going with this. And in this episode, Broken Pieces, we start to see some of these threads that they have introduced throughout the past 7 episodes get woven together. The show has these characters that feel very fleshed out and well-rounded in our understanding of them at this point, and they're having great backstories while still having a plot going forward. And in that way, they are already doing miles better than Season 1 of Star Trek Enterprise. Don't get me wrong, guys, I do actually like Enterprise. It's just that they did not have a real primary plot, really, and a solid protagonist until about halfway through Season 3. That, for me, is when Enterprise really hit its stride, but by that point, they'd essentially already been canceled because, they only got 4 seasons. So, for me, in comparison, Star Trek Picard has already started out with a bang, and it's already more sustainable with having a longer plot than Enterprise even was for me. So I really like it. I understand a lot of people don't, and once I get through all of Season 1 and doing these episode recaps, we're going to really talk at length about precisely what people are having a problem with in Star Trek Picard and my refutations for that. But first up, Episode 8. So in Broken Pieces, we're seeing all of these threads start getting really woven together. We are getting into different layers of these characters as well. And we are seeing that there's a lot more going on in the story than just Picard himself. A lot of these characters are really interesting in their own right. And as we start this particular episode out, Picard and Agnes Jurati and Raffi and Captain Rios are all on the ship with Soji. The ship is called the La Sirena, if you are just tuning in for the first time. And they are on their way to Soji's homeworld. So they found out from Kestra and her crazy old hermit friend that this planet was in a specific system, and they are out there looking for it as we speak. So on this voyage out into the world, or the galaxy, really, they are going to be trying to find this crazy planet that has multiple suns that are like very red, and they are also looking for a lot of electrical activity. So they're pretty sure they found it. And Picard and Soji are just now getting reunited with the crew of the La Sirena following their pickup on Nepenthe. Because remember, in the end of episode 6, they were taken from the Borg Queen's chamber on the artifact and transported to Nepenthe, where the La Sirena was supposed to pick them up, and it's taken them a while to get there. So they chilled with Riker and Troy for a while, and their daughter Kestra, and now they are all back together. So they've missed a little bit, including Agnes injecting herself with some form of medication, a hypo spray, in order to cancel out the tracer device or the tracking device that is inside of her body. And so it's some sort of chemical compound, and she needed to neutralize it with that hypo spray. So she's already gone kind of past the point of no return. She killed Bruce Maddox, but at this point she is definitely having a crisis of conscience and has gone ahead and decided she's not going to be a part of this anymore in helping Commodore O and the Romulans track down her friends. She's become attached to these people. And really, this is a failure on Commodore O's part. Let's be honest. One look at Agnes Jurati does not really say that this is a person who is going to have the steel cojones to go through with all of this. I'm surprised she even got through the point of killing Maddox. But she was able to do that part, but now the guilt is really gnawing at her. Agnes is not built for this kind of thing. She is a squishy goo, so I'm talking about like Alan Watts and everything. She's not prickly at all, so Agnes is just all goo, and it's really hard for her to deal with this. So I blame Commodore O for this partly. You would think that as the head of Starfleet security and also a high-ranking member of the Zhat Vash / the Tal Shiar, that Commodore O would really understand who is a valuable asset and who is a liability at this point. And your girl done messed up when she picked Agnes Jurati to be the one to go and kill them. Now, I get from a strategic point of view why O would think that Agnes might be a good choice for that. She would be able to get in there with Picard. Picard already knows her, and she's one of few people who knows about this quest. And the evidence is rather compelling from the mind meld. However, this girl is not made for that. Come on. She's a squishy goo scientist. I get that she was the lover of Bruce Maddox at one point, but O had to have known that this had a high probability of going sideways. But it seems that she didn't, which is interesting given how much she berated Narissa and threatened both Narissa and Narek's lives should this not work out this time with their plan for Soji on the artifact. So also, that plan has absolutely gone sideways. Is Commodore O going to kill Narek and Narissa? Are we ever going to hear about that again? We'll find out. But for right now, we are picking up with them on the ship, heading towards Soji's homeworld. And there's a lot more going on. There is more exposition than there normally is in Star Trek in general, and especially in Picard. Y'all know I don't love exposition, but there's a lot going on that they're having to fill in. I'll give it a pass. And they're letting us know exactly about the origin of the Jat So the Jat is like even more secret than the Tal Shiar were. So it's like a KGB within a KGB or something. The Russian nesting doll of KGBs. I'm not even sure at this point. But the Romulans are trying to keep synthetic life forms from coming into existence because essentially all of this has happened before. And by that, they mean that at one point, synthetic life forms wiped out all of humanity. And the Romulans came across some evidence of that at one point and are now trying to prevent it from happening again, because those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. We all know that adage, right? And the Jat are taking that particularly hard, and they are taking it to heart. So they're just determined not to let anyone get wiped out again. But what really happened, more or less, there was a point in synthetic life a long time ago that has really resulted in the concept of the singularity, the ultimate combination or merging of organic and inorganic life forms. So there was a singularity convergent, more or less, and it did not go well for everyone. Well, not for everyone who was fully organic, at least. And now there is a planet that they really call the Grief World. And, you know, I'm sure that just naming it the Grief World, I wouldn't want to visit that for a holiday. So, you know, great job on that branding, the Romulans. Great job. Great job. So they go over there to the Grief World. Yeah, it's also called Aya, but the Grief World is my favorite name for it. And it is a place where the Jat Vache are initiated, more or less. So they go through training, they know what the Jat Vache is, but then they get exposed to this type of, it's not quite a mind meld, but it is some type of vision that they're interacting with this rock and stuff as a ritual. And it's showing them the vision of what happened before and what they've interpreted may happen again. And it is so striking for a lot of them that they kill themselves right there when it happens. The rest of them do not have their sanity at that point. So some are really messed up, some are dead, and it's a pretty violent scene. They go ahead and do exercise and flex that MA rating for having this on CBS All Access instead of having it on network television. And it's pretty hardcore, you guys. But it also really gets the point across as to how freaked out and upsetting this is for the Romulans, who are generally a pretty chill species, even if they are a bit aggressive in many ways and also very suspicious / paranoid. So it is a big deal, and I think they do a really good job flexing that MA rating to get the point across. And we see that Narissa has been through this along with her auntie, who was one of the XBs who was on the artifact. In fact, she was the one that they referred to as Ramda, who Soji met with, and Ramda yelled at her, calling her the Destroyer, and asked if she was the sister who lives or the one who dies. And so even folks who do survive this experience on the Grief World are very much changed in many ways. And we can see perhaps in that way why it impacted Agnes so much that it turned this otherwise very peaceable person into someone who was murdering her ex-lover for the good of humanity, even though she did not actually experience that firsthand at the Grief World or on the Grief World. It was secondhand via a mind meld, but it's that powerful and that upsetting that it can change people to their core. All right, we're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about how that goes with Agnes. Stay tuned.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now, don't bother, what's hot on Netflix, and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about the concept of the juxtaposed and their birth in response to the vision that they encountered on the grief world and why they are out there trying to get rid of all the synths. It is very easy early on in the show to just go, oh, okay, all the Romulans are just kind of racist or xenophobic in a way towards synths, in ways that we've seen happen throughout the years in Star Trek, when people would react to Data in different ways, and ways we've also seen in Stargate SG-1, in which they were having people on one planet react to Teal'c, not because Teal'c was a Jaffa, but rather because Teal'c was very clearly a breeder, as they called them. So that one was kind of the inverse, where they were cloning and they didn't believe in physical reproduction anymore, which is somewhere between Demolition Man and Star Trek Picard in the mandorla of this Venn diagram. But I digress. You guys get the point that this is very much a similar type of perspective on this, and that it's very striking to people when they are encountering this vision. So, Agnes has been exposed to it, and it has resulted in her feeling upset enough that she went ahead and lied to everyone in order to get on this ship, and then went through with killing Bruce Maddox. I really like how they show her degrading, though, at that point. So yes, she killed Bruce, but she's really not dealing well with it. She's been trying to stuff it down with turning to sex. When Rafi offered her drugs/alcohol, she didn't really seem to pick up on the fact that that's what Rafi was offering her, and instead opted for chocolate cake, because that is who Agnes is as a person. And I like that juxtaposition of showing us that yes, she's capable of murder, but she had to have a very solid reason for that, because it is tearing her up inside, but she's still a person who is rather naive and innocent in many ways, and she's not even turning to alcohol at this point, you guys. Her idea of hitting the hard stuff is having some red velvet cake from the replicator. And you see Rafi kind of raise an eyebrow at it, but she's like, all right, she's fragile. We're going to go ahead and just get her chocolate cake. So this has been a really good development for me in showing and not telling. Agnes has no one to talk to about this, and they don't go through some weird diary route in order to get it across, or a captain's log kind of route like they may have done in the past. Instead, we see her just slowly losing her calm until she just panics, really. She knows that they're being chased by Narek, and she does not outright say anything to anyone. She almost tells them, but then she just hits herself with the hypo spray, and it knocks her out. But she is resigned to doing the right thing right now. And I like how that goes, because it doesn't really let her off the hook for murdering Maddox. It's still something that is messed up, but we are going to see how her crew members deal with it when she wakes up from her coma. Because indeed, the tracker that Commodore O put in her body that she had to chemically neutralize, the neutralization process did indeed put her into a coma. the EMH was just like, what the heck? But at this point, Rafi and Rios aren't idiots, and they have figured out that Narek is no longer tracking them. They don't know that it's specifically Narek, just that it's a Romulan. And they know that he's no longer able to follow them anymore. So they've kind of figured out, she got knocked out. They're not being followed anymore. She was the one who had the tracker in her. So when she wakes up, Picard is also there at this point. And he looks so very disappointed. Picard is really good with the disappointed dad type of coaching or leadership style. And it's just like, oof, I have let down a great man. And I love how Sir Patrick Stewart gets that across. So they're not happy. I'm sure Rios probably has a lot of feelings right now, having slept with Agnes in the middle of this chew. But he didn't really know Maddox. He was a random person to Rios. But still, she killed her ex-lover. And that's gotta make a man feel a certain type of way. But at this point, Agnes tells Soji that she wants to know more about her. And Soji's like, I can handle myself. Like, let me just sit here and talk to this girl for a while. And so they sit there and they have a discussion about what's going on with Soji and what Soji is capable of. And Agnes is just totally enthralled and awed by what she sees. And in this way, it's kind of similar to how Kestra reacts to Soji. Although as a child, Kestra is just more animated about a lot of her questions and is less inhibited. And also, Kestra didn't just murder somebody and wasn't sent there to murder Soji. So that conversation goes a little bit different. But having seen that interaction with Kestra, I really like the parallels of seeing that with Agnes as well. And seeing that awe. Because scientists are really just kids who never stopped asking why. And that is one of the things I love the most about scientists in general. And it's part of what gives Agnes that quality of naivety in a way. So she is always awed at the world around her and at the concept that something she had been working on for years with Bruce, because they weren't just lovers, they were co-workers, they were colleagues, and she sees that he's done it. He has used some of Data's positronic cells to create an organic inorganic. Soji is the singularity at this point. And she has mucus, and she has tears, and she eats when she's hungry, and she cries when she's sad, and she has dreams. And that is so wild for Agnes. Indeed, that's very wild for us to think about at this point too. We may have seen that in other movies, but right now, I mean, my iPhone has Siri, but Siri doesn't really have any personality other than what we've programmed. Whereas Soji has a specific type of algorithm in her body that is helping her to learn and grow and change as she goes along. And I do mean grow as in developing, not necessarily growing or aging physically, but it is helping her develop. Soji is a life form. She reacts to the world around her and she changes her responses in response to the stimuli that she's exposed to. So she is trusting to different degrees. She is hopeful to different degrees. And she even has her own ethical concerns. She is everything that Data wanted her to be. And I think that's really beautiful, considering that Data had painted those pictures for Picard years and years ago of the girl by the sea, I believe is where she was standing, in a hooded cloak, and it was called Daughter. So I think that's really beautiful because she is everything that Data would have wanted and that he tried to create in The Next Generation with Lal. So this works out really well for us in getting to see this. It's beautiful. It is the culmination of so many years of TNG if you watch that first, especially that season 2, episode 9, Measure of a Man. And it's just really touching in a way for me. I'm not about to burst into tears or anything like that, but I do feel whelming emotions from it, and seeing how Agnes reacts to Soji with almost tears in her eyes. You can tell Agnes feels guilt and sorrow for what she's done, but she also experiences awe and is captivated by the life form that's in front of her. And she asks her all these questions, and with tears in her eyes, she's like, I could never go through with it. I was sent here to kill you, but I could never go through with it, especially after having met you. Like, I would never do that. And Soji can read body language and tell whether someone is lying and stuff. And she's like, I know, I believe you. And so she says that she's going to turn herself in for the murder as soon as they reach Deep Space 12. Agnes very much has ethics and her own convictions, and it would have had to take a lot to get her to kill someone. And that is really what this episode is primarily about, is showing us who Agnes really is. And I think that since they've shown us this slow descent into the guilt and everything, that it makes sense as we see her come out the other side, having decided she's going to turn herself in. So Picard lets her wander around the ship and have unsupervised access to Soji. And some people had problems with that, but I mean, come on. Soji busted her way through the floor of a Borg ship. Can you imagine how strong the floors of a Borg ship are when they have taken everyone else's technological distinctiveness and aligned it with their own? Soji is super strong, and I think that she could totally take Agnes. So I don't have a problem with that. Also, this is not a Federation ship. There is no brig, really, to put Agnes. There are no holding cells, at least as far as we have seen. I am sure that the hologram, who is the hospitality one, could make up a prison if they wanted him to. But honestly, there's no reason to. Any of them could take on Agnes. She seems truly repentant at this point. And I'm sure Picard and Rios and Rafi have met enough actual murderers in their lives to know one when they see one. Not someone who is, has murdered someone, but really someone who is dark-hearted, I suppose. And Agnes may have murdered someone, so she is technically a murderer, but she does not have the heart of a killer. So that doesn't really bother me in that regard. I also like that Soji asked a lot of questions to Agnes, though, and especially the ones that were related to whether Agnes viewed her as a person. And it really gets to the heart of the philosophy that we've been discussing for the past 7 or 8 episodes now. And that is really, what is humanity? What constitutes a human? And what are human rights at that point? I think it's absolutely beautiful, and the actresses do a wonderful job tying that up with a bow in the middle of this conflict resolution. We're going to go on another quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about where that leaves Picard and his conversation with Soji about Data.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about Agnes's confrontation with Soji regarding killing Bruce Maddox, and how mostly Picard just looked really disappointed in her, which is kind of funny given that she has murdered someone, but this is not his first rodeo with a murderer, so he's just like, man, I wish this wasn't happening again. I'm just disappointed. I'm not even mad, just disappointed. Is what it really looks like at that point. But I get it. So this episode is really doing a good job in showing who he is at this point. Nepenthe was really about who Picard was before, and Deanna and Riker setting him straight as to how he needs to approach this and everything. But now we're really getting to dig into who he's been for the past 14 years and who he is now. Because this is not the same Picard that we are familiar with from TNG and the movies. He's not a captain anymore. He's technically not even an admiral. He's retired at this point, and he's been retired for a long time. So he is still Picard, but Captain Picard is like 5 Picards ago. And I think that is really exceptional in the writing and in the way that Sir Patrick Stewart portrays Picard. As I discussed in the last episode, he really nails being the same person who has developed along the line. And we can see how Patrick Stewart is bringing some of his own experience in real life into who Picard is at this age. I absolutely love it. We also are seeing as we go along that Picard is more comfortable with vulnerability now than he was in the past, but not excessively so. It's not like he has suddenly become Deanna at this point. It's more like he is now somewhat comfortable at certain points in letting down his guard and being able to express affection for people he's particularly close to. He's able to admit that even though he doesn't like most kids, he likes Elnor, and that was from 14 years ago in that flashback. We also have seen him hug Deanna and hug Riker and sit there on that bench with Riker's arm around him, and just the most delightful display of wholesome masculinity I have seen on television in at least the past year. It was so heartwarming. And you can see that this is kind of a different Picard. I cannot really imagine Picard sitting there with number 1's arm around him from TNG. Can you? But it is indeed still Picard. He's still being stubborn, and he's still pursuing a mission doggedly. So I really love seeing him delve more into that vulnerability. And you can see that he's not entirely comfortable in talking about this with Soji, but he also understands from his conversation with Deanna that he's going to have to deal with that because Soji is not one of his crew members. She's not Starfleet in any way. She's an anthropologist, and she is a synthetic life form who has just learned that she's synthetic, but she has all of the emotions of a woman her age. And he's going to have to deal with that differently. So Soji in this scene is really talking to Picard about Data in general. Because Data is effectively in some ways her father. He's her progenitor, I suppose. Even if Maddox was the one who technically created her from Data's positronic cells. So she wants to know a little bit about where she came from. And that's really what we're looking for right now. We're looking for her planet. We're looking where Soji came from. We are looking at the origins of the Zhat Vash. We're looking at what compelled Agnes to commit this terrible crime. And so it's telling us a bit about our characters' journeys right now. And so she wants to understand Data through Picard, and also understand Picard through Data and how he talks about his friend who was a synthetic life form and who was far less organic than Soji, although in many ways Data was just as human. So she's asking Picard about how he feels about him. How did Data view you? What do you think he would think about you now? That kind of thing. And Picard's like, how would I know that? And that's such an INTJ response. But he's just like, I don't understand the question, does not compute. And you can see in some ways that that's perhaps why Picard felt so close to Data. And he was able to go ahead and just be himself. And Data did not expect any displays of affection. Data did not have a malicious bone in his body. He was just saying what he had to say, even if it was perhaps not necessarily hurtful, but not really what they wanted to hear. Data was always candid and forthright, and it was never to hurt someone's feelings. And you can see how, for a man like Picard, that would easily cause him to feel more fondness for a person like that. So Picard's like, I can't really answer that. I don't know how Data viewed me. And she asks if Data loved him. And he explains that Data's capacity for expressing and processing feelings like affection and love and stuff like that was limited. And he's like, I guess we kind of had that in common. And Soji tells him really that she thinks that Data loved him. And she's like, he's a part of me. I think that he loved you. And I can tell that you loved him. And it's a really beautiful moment in exploring more about humanity. And not just Soji's and Data's, but also Picard's. Remember, the measure of a man is not just about Data specifically, even though that's how they use that season 2 episode of TNG to really foray into what human rights really are. And if they are truly inalienable, and if so, to whom do they apply? It's also about Picard's humanity. He is human by the default status of having been born instead of created. But he also is struggling with his humanity. Even before he was assimilated and became Locutus of Borg, Picard always had trouble processing and expressing his emotions. And so he is being very vulnerable right now in having this conversation with Soji. But because he is different now a little bit from who he was before, and he's had this conversation with Deanna, he understands that vulnerability can also be a tool. And not in a manipulative way, but rather it can be used as a strength. And that is something else I love about Picard. He can be very stubborn, he can be very arrogant, but when push comes to shove, if his folks, who he really trusts, tell him that there is a different path or a middle path or just a better path, he's going to take it. And he does such a good job in this episode of it being very authentic and sincere. You don't feel at any point that Picard is trying to manipulate Soji through this. His discomfort is palpable, and I think it's really beautiful in seeing him push through this to have this very real conversation with Soji about a person whom he did love, and he still loves even though Data is gone. He still dreams of Data often, and you can tell that he misses him. In a way, he may even ache for Data in the way that Deanna says that Kestra aches for her brother Thad, who passed away. And I think that's also very interesting because Thad could have been saved by positronic research, and Data was created from positrons. So you very much, in these episodes, have kind of a semiotic square going on in regards to having things that are very similar to each other and inverse opposites and inverses and just opposites, and how that all layers on top of each other to really create a solid, cohesive feeling for the show and for the characters, and it really fleshes it out. And you guys, there's nothing I love more in breaking down shows than a good semiotic square. All right, we are going to go on another break. And when we come back, we are going to talk about what else Picard is up to and what is happening with Elnor and 7 of 9 on the artifact. Stay tuned.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about Picard's conversation with Soji regarding who Data was to Picard and who Picard was to Data. And she's really using this to feel out who Picard is. And we are also seeing him try to use a new tool set for Picard, and that is honesty and invulnerability. So Picard is an honest man, but he's using it in a very vulnerable way. And I love how they do this because it also echoes the Qowat Milat path of pure candor. And it's showing what he's learned from all of these different groups over time. And the lack of exposition in that is absolutely stunning. It is artfully masterful, and I absolutely cannot wait to see more of the show, you guys. I know a lot of people don't like it, but I think that they're just not digging deep enough for the most part. Star Trek does not do things on accident in general. They have been layering references to Voyager and to Don Quixote and to TNG and to Tragic Sense of Life. Like, they're reaching to philosophy and classic literature. They have referenced Homer's The Odyssey as well in the name Nepenthe, and are talking about how trying to forget about something or forgetting about something doesn't erase the past. It's actually very beautiful and almost lyrical in a way if you are looking at the things that are not seen or said as much as the things that are said. And I think that that may be a reason why I didn't really like Stardust City Rag that much, is a lot of it is just them planning out the heist. And it's so expositional that I didn't love it. I just didn't love it. No offense, Jonathan Frakes. I love your work and I love everybody in the show, but I just did not love it. But this one, in comparison, is very striking to me, and it's surprising, especially considering how a lot of people considered this one to be too expositional, or more expositional, and a lot of folks love Stardust City Rag. Who knows? We're all different types of people, and we're all going to get something different from what we watch. But now that Picard has had this conversation with Soji, he reaches out to Starfleet and talks to Admiral Clancy, and is like, hey, I know you told me I couldn't have any ships, and I couldn't have my reinstatement as an admiral and all of this other stuff, but can I have some help now? And Admiral Clancy says yes, and we get Picard jubilantly clapping his hands, and I love it. So it's just like a single clap where he's like, yes, we got it. But it's adorable. It's so Picard. And we are also seeing that there is some other stuff going on outside of the La Sirena. So remember, Elnor snuck onto the Borg artifact and is now in the middle of a whole bunch of Romulans, which isn't that bad because he's a Romulan, but it is a problem because a lot of them are Zhat Vash and he is Qowat Milat. Even if he cannot be Qowat Milat in name, he was trained just as they were. He was raised by the nuns, and Narissa recognizes that in him as soon as she sees him. So when he had his fight with her in the last episode, she tells him, put that sword down, and I'm going to put my gun down, and we are going to talk and fight the way that Zhat Vash and Qowat Milat are meant to. So for Narissa, this is very interesting to me that she doesn't really use it to ridicule him or anything, even though men are not supposed to be able to be Qowat Milat. She just goes ahead and goes, okay, you are a warrior and an exceptional one. You are from a particular group that my group is meant to fight, and we are diametrically opposed in every way. Everything from the pure candor versus the Zhat Vash's intense secrecy and so many layers of lies that they have 3 different names and everything. It's so incredibly different and juxtaposed, and she immediately recognizes that in him, even though men are not allowed to take that name. So I thought that was very interesting about her as a character, because she's incredibly shady, but for her, she's just like, oh cool, a challenge. She doesn't really care that he is male in any way. And I found that very intriguing. So, on the artifact, Elnor, fortunately, has been able to team up with 7 of 9 now, because he was pretty screwed when we left him last time. Hugh was dead. Elnor does not know his way around the ship. He does not know how to find an ally. And the kid is just pure candor on a spaceship full of lies. So, it was bad news bears for Elnor until 7 showed up, who is the best person to help him out. So remember, she's been with the Raiders out there trying to keep the rest of the galaxy clean in that dead zone between Romulan and Federation space and in part of Romulan space. And he called for the Raiders, and she's the one who showed up. So she is by herself, as 7 now likes to be. And especially since she's lost Icheb, she is a mother without a child, more or less. And so this is a really good match, I think, on this show. I really like seeing how Elnor interacts with 7 and how he's really an orphan who doesn't know necessarily motherly love. He grew up with the nuns, and the nuns were good to him and everything. But he and 7 are both hard and soft in very similar ways. They're both squishy and, gooey and prickly, like Alan Watts says. So I love how they are paired up in this. They were both taken as children or abandoned as children. So Elnor's parents were not ever set back with him after the explosion on Mars and everything. And 7 was taken and assimilated as a Borg when she was younger. So they've both effectively grown up more or less as orphans. And they have a lot of unresolved feelings from that. And 7 also has a lot of pin-up rage from what happened with Icheb. So she is now here helping him. And it doesn't seem like 2 people would be enough to really deal with the Zhat Vash and all of the other Romulans on board the ship. But remember, 7 has an ace in the hole, and that is the fact that she used to be a Borg. And as Hugh told Elnor in the last episode, all he needs is another XB to get to the Queen's chamber and activate it. Also, because 7 was an XB, she just knows how to navigate around the Borg cube. She knows how everything works, and so on and so forth. So this is really the best of all possible outcomes and the best of all possible worlds. And I do mean that genuinely, even if Voltaire uses it a little bit differently, typically in Candide. That is where we're getting at this point. So considering this is not the best of all possible worlds, but it's the best outcome for Elnor, they go ahead and find the Queen's chamber. But in order to save the Borg and everyone else on board who are not terrible guys, there is a big problem, and she has an ethical conundrum to face. Really more of a quandary, I suppose. But in order to save the Borg, because Narissa is wanting to shut them all down and kill them, she's going to have to essentially enslave them. So she's going to have to wake up the Borg that are remaining, who have not been turned into XBs, and more or less reassimilate them as a mini collective. Now, they're just in their stasis pods, their charging stations, so they're not out there running around or anything, so it's not like they're actively awake or anything like that. But having once been a Borg herself, and knowing what that is like to be a Borg and an ex-Borg, and also having been just purely human before that, being an individual, as Seven would put it, rather than being part of a collective, she has a big ethical problem here. And Elnor's like, well, just set him loose afterwards. And she explains that if she goes ahead and reactivates the Borg now, they won't want to be released. That's just part of how the collective and the nanites and stuff work. And she also explains that she might not want to release them as a Borg queen. It's really cool, and I love how Seven mulls this over. She's been searching for her humanity for the past, who knows however many years, since Janeway restored her to being an XB, even though that's not what she refers to herself as. But she has said before she didn't want to live among humans, and she's living that out now, being out by herself out in space. What happened to Chakotay? Who knows? But she was just traveling with Icheb, who was a fellow XB, and now she is back by herself. She did not want to be in the company of humans. And so now, while out searching for her humanity, she is facing the possibility of having to be a Borg again in a way that is for good, but she knows can easily turn sideways because absolute power corrupts absolutely, and Seven knows that. We're going to go on another quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about what Seven ends up deciding to do and where we see the rest of the team.
The GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about where Elnor and Seven are at this point in the plot, and how Seven is really struggling with her own humanity and in trying to figure out how she can save her fellow Borg brethren who are still in their stasis pods. She's going to have to activate them, perhaps, in order to save them, because Narissa is shutting them all down and killing them where they stand while they are totally passive. But if Seven activates them to save them, she's going to have to do that via forced enslavement. So it's a really hard decision for her to make. And what she ends up having to do is Narissa forces her hand at that point, and she goes ahead and does it. It is a really cool moment to see Seven go full Borg Queen. So before, she was a drone, but in the Queen's chamber, she is now acting as the Borg Queen. And she has the attachments up in her spine and everything, just like we have seen in Star Trek First Contact with the Borg Queen. It was super neat how they put that scene together visually. It was quite stunning and even, dare I say, chilling to see this happen, and you don't know what's going to happen, whether she's going to be able to let go or not. She's already told Elnor, I might not want to release them. I may be kind of addicted to this. And her eyes really go black and everything. But she goes ahead and saves most of the Romulans, but then a ton of them get sucked out into space by the Romulans. They go ahead and essentially eject them out the airlocks, more or less, just in order to get rid of all of them. And you can see that this is really crushing for Seven. She's already had to violate her personal ethics and integrity in order to do this thing. And remember, at this point, Seven doesn't necessarily have a lot of ethics. There's not a lot of things Seven won't do at this point. We just watched her blast her way out of more or less a nightclub or a cantina in Stardust City Rag, and she purposely went back to that place in order to kill the lady who had been associated with Icheb's death, even after Picard had set them loose, and she did it without telling Picard. Picard still does not know that that happened. But as Seven explained to that lady right before she killed her, Picard still believes that there is good out there, and Seven has essentially been out with the Borg and with the Raiders and everyone in this section of space for so long that she doesn't think that her humanity can be fully reclaimed. But also, remember, Picard was assimilated and became Locutus of Borg as an adult, and Annika/Seven was assimilated at a very young age. She was a child at the time, and so for her, most of her life at this point has just really been one terrible tragedy after another. And with Icheb's death being so recent, I would imagine that she has that mother's rage and she's not having a good time trying to process those emotions, and she's going to have to dig deep to find that humanity. But for her, she does recognize that the Borg are victims. Very much so, because she used to be in their shoes, and so she views them the same way that Hugh does, and that Picard now can largely view them. He's still pretty skeeved out by a lot of the Borg drones, and it gives him panic attacks, but that's more so related to his flashbacks and fear, rather than how he views the drones in particular. And he was really excited by Hugh's work. Not really excited. Excited is the wrong word for it. He was pleased, I think, and kind of cautiously optimistic about Hugh's work to show people that the XBs are victims and that they are not traitorous monsters. They were made to do all of these things. And when you unassimilate them or de-assimilate them, then they can perhaps go back to a kind of middle ground somewhere. And for Picard, because he was a Borg at one point, he's still searching for that humanity, and he knows that that's difficult. And I love seeing how Seven is looking for that too. I know I could go on about this one all day, you guys. I really, really love how Seven and Picard are juxtaposed with their sense of semiotics regarding their directions in searching for their humanity. And just the whole concept of what is humanity in this show it's absolutely beautiful. It's amazing, and I can't believe that so many people don't like the show, to be honest. I just can't, I don't understand it, but we'll get to that in a future episode. So for right now, we have Seven enslaving the Borg, and then most of them still getting blown out of the airlocks by Narissa and them. And Narissa is cold and calculating, so that was a smart move on Narissa's part. I will give her that. But Seven only stays in that Borg Queen mode long enough to go ahead and release all of them, and then Elnor turns and looks at her and is like, hey, are you going to assimilate me now? And it's so adorable because he's, kind of scared, but he's also just a little resigned to it. And it's very honest it's an honest question. It's not him being prepared to fight her or anything. He knows that she had to do something for the greater good, and you can see he respects that. But he's just kind of resigned about it and scared, and he's like, are you going to assimilate me now? And you see that even though he's a great warrior at this point, he is still very childlike in many ways, very similar to Agnes in that respect. And I think that that also helps ground Seven. And she turns to him before the plug pulls out of her spine with her eyes still black. And in her Borg Queen voice says, Annika still has work to do. So that's also telling us that there is a demarcation somewhere within Seven where part of her is Annika and part of her is Seven of Nine. And there is a differentiation sometimes in how she probably thinks of and refers to herself in her personal narrative. So I thought they did a great job in that one sentence. Annika still has work to do. 6 words, and getting across where Seven totally is in her search for her humanity. So she may have said that she does not think that there is any good out there anymore, or that humanity is not something that can necessarily be reclaimed, at least not in totality. But at some point, she does still have that part of her inside that is Annika. So I really love that scene as well. But it does detach from her, and she gets to go about her business. But it is another really great concept of fate versus free will. So that's what we're really seeing with Agnes too, is them having to choose between what they feel is definitely going to happen, what is certain, and what is actionable in a way. That also really applies to Soji too. Does she have a choice as to whether or not she's the destroyer of worlds? Or is the sheer prophecy enough to really seal her fate? Does she have any will at that point? And if so, does that imply that she is more organic than inorganic? What does that say about her humanity? Where does she lie in fate and free will? And so you can also draw a semiotic square to understand the characters and the plot within that context. So with semiotic squares, we are using binary opposites to really understand the boundaries of what we're looking for. I'll have to make a YouTube video for you guys one day or something, because semiotic squares, you really need to see them to understand them very well. But pretty much you're just putting 2 things juxtaposed from each other, and then you're seeing what their parallels are and what their opposites and their inverse opposites are. And their inverse. They can get really layered and really complicated, but they're beautiful, and I really love how the writers, directors, and actors are getting this across in the show. The powers that be, so the Zhat Vash, Starfleet, etc., don't seem to think that there is such a thing as free will at this point that could save them. They think that it's fate. So the Zhat Vash have shown the higher-ups at Starfleet and everything, perhaps, we don't know how far in cahoots everyone is, how this is going to end up if we do reach the singularity, and how other synths are going to come and destroy the rest of the organic life forms in favor of the inorganics, or the synths. So we don't really know how far that control extends, but we do know that Starfleet isn't Starfleet anymore, and part of that, I do believe, is their understanding of free will versus fate, or their belief in it at this point, and where they are on that spectrum of belief. I think that also is strongly tied to humanity. I think that for Picard, Starfleet isn't just not Starfleet anymore, but for him, Starfleet has lost their humanity by believing that they are tied to this fate and are unable to exercise free will and find a middle path. It's very well written, and I'm very excited to see what Soji decides to do and what 7 of 9 decides to do. will Seven return to being a Borg at some point? Because the statement, Annika still has work to do, implies that she might, at some point, return to being a Borg. It's not necessarily I'm not ever going to be a Borg. It is a not now, rather. So it's really tabling the conversation. Those 6 words tell us so much about Seven and her journey at that point. We're going to go on another break, and when we come back, we're going to wrap up where everyone is in the episode, especially with the La Sirena and what Rios and Rafi are up to. Stay tuned.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back. In our last segment, we were talking about the concept of fate versus free will in Star Trek Picard and how that ties into the concept of humanity and how Starfleet has perhaps lost their humanity at this point, as well as Seven and Soji's choices going forward regarding their fates versus their free will. Now we're going to talk about where Rafi and Rios are in this episode. In this episode, the EMH has kept the alcohol away from Rafi and is refusing to give her access to it at this point. So Rafi is sober, she's in full command of her wits, and as we saw in the flashback in one of the early episodes, she was a force to be reckoned with early on. She was a very bright young officer, and she's really good with her intuition as well as her detective skills. So in this episode, Rafi has spent a lot of time interrogating the La Sirena's emergency holograms. Now there are 5 of them that we see at this point, and I do believe that is all of them now. So when Rios got the ship, he went ahead and selected the default setting of going ahead and scanning himself for them. He claims it was an accident, but who knows? So he also went through and peeled parts of his memories from them. So Rafi needs to have all of them together in order to really get the full picture. And so we have Ian, the engineering hologram, who has the Scottish accent. We also have Emmett, who is the extra pair of hands on the bridge. So he may be the pilot or he may be manning the weapons. Goes either way. It's kind of like Luke Skywalker helping Han Solo by going down to the turret guns. He's down there to shoot, but Luke could technically also fly if Han ever let anyone else touch the helm of the Falcon. We also have the ENH, and they refer to him as Enoch. He's the navigational hologram. And we have the hospitality hologram, whose name I admittedly did not catch. I'm not sure if he's been given a name, though, as Rios really does not like him. He deals with him the least, intentionally, and mostly keeps the poor hospitality program shut down. But the feeling seems to be mutual. The hospitality hologram does not seem to be very fond of Rios either. So the actor who plays all of these different characters, that's 6 so far, you guys. Santiago Cabrera is absolutely amazing. I love how he gives each of these characters a lot of nuance. They don't just look different, they sound different, they have different postures, they act different, they have different moods and personalities and dispositions, I think is really the word that I'm looking for. And so far in all of Sci-Fi of folks playing multiple characters, my favorite is still Tatiana Maslany in Orphan Black. She does a mind-bending job playing so many different clones. But Santiago Cabrera, what I have seen so far from him in this season of Star Trek Picard has also been very great. I also want to give a shout out to the girl who plays Soji, because there are a couple of Sojis, and it's pretty wild. We do see that in this episode that Rios kind of reacts strangely to seeing Soji for the first time. So when they pick them up from Nepenthe at the beginning of this episode, this is the first time he's actually seen who they're looking for. And it is shocking for him. So we learn about that as Rafi goes through and interrogates all of the emergency holograms. And as she learns from them and then goes to speak to Rios about them, tracks him down in his room and forces her way in more or less, we find that a long time ago, Rios knew someone named Jana who looks like Soji. She looks exactly like her, and that's why he freaked initially. So we know that he's carrying around some kind of dark baggage, but we don't know what it is yet until this episode. So this is where we really flesh it out. And we see that the captain he worked with before, Alonzo Vandermeer, ended up murdering her and her companion. And we only see them in Rios' sketch. So they came from Soji's home planet, and they seemed really friendly, but Vandermeer received a black flag directive, and meaning they told him to do essentially some black ops off the book stuff and kill them. And it was Starfleet who told them to do so. They got intel that they were synths, and they forced Vandermeer to kill him. And so for Rios, this was particularly appalling as a young man who looked up to Alonzo Vandermeer and regarded him so highly, and he was essentially like his number one. So this was really hard for him to understand why he would have done that. And if we sit here and we think about it, we know that Janeway and Picard and Kirk and Archer and Sisko would have made some very different decisions, but they are not all Starfleet officers. And unfortunately, Vandermeer felt that this was something that he had to do. I dare say that even with Jack O'Neill's Black Ops history, Jack O'Neill would not have made that call the same as Vandermeer did either. But that doesn't detract from the fact that Vandermeer still could have been a great man, but felt compelled to follow this order for reasons not unlike those that Agnes has when Agnes kills Bruce Maddox. And so in this way, we can see that even though it may be really upsetting to everyone on board the ship that Agnes killed Maddox, different people on the ship have different ways of understanding it and different reasons for it. So there are multiple reasons, perhaps, as to why she is not just locked up somewhere. It's not that there's just not a brig. It's also that Soji can take care of herself, and it's also that Rios actually understands where this really comes from, this kind of compulsion or this feeling that you have to do something that you really don't want to do, and you think that you're having to do it for the greater good. So when this happened and Vandermeer had to kill both of them, Rios confronted him about it and was incredibly disappointed in his mentor and hero for doing this. And just Vandermeer was overcome with guilt at that point, much like how Agnes is at this point, as well as being confronted with Rios' disappointment, confirming that Vandermeer did indeed make the wrong call, even if it was a directive from a superior. And Vandermeer ended up killing himself. And Rios, that really messed him up. And he doesn't want to get attached to captains anymore. So he's the captain of his own ship. He does not want to be in that situation where he is beholden to another person, and he takes that risk of being vulnerable and trusting someone like that, and also in looking up to them, because it was his hero that did this. And they discharged him from Starfleet for it as well. They discharged Rios from Starfleet for it. And I just expect him to keep his mouth shut. And I think it's really interesting how they are juxtaposing Picard in that manner with Rios. So I feel that Rios also thinks that maybe he let Vandermeer down by not guiding him more and maybe not being a better number one at that point. And it doesn't matter if that is true in Rios's case. A lot of the things that we all beat ourselves up about aren't true. They are just different insecurities, really. We are using these insecurities to try to make sense of the world around us in a way. And so he can't really come to terms with the fact that it's just Vandermeer who let him down. I think that Rios also feels some sense of responsibility. So not only is he crushed that his hero did this, but he is also reluctant to take on that type of supportive role where he may potentially fail his captain in the future. Whereas Picard is really reluctant to get the people who used to have his back, his old crew, together, because he knows they would do it out of a sense of honor and duty and allegiance to him. But having lost Data in the way that he did, Picard is really reluctant to be truly in command again, in a way. He's reluctant to have his old crew back. He's reluctant to get close to a lot of other people again. And you can also see that he even estranged himself in many ways from many of the people he had been close to before. And he was just living out his days at the vineyard. You can tell he hadn't seen Deanna and Riker in person in a long time because Thad had been dead for a while. He was old enough that Kestra knew him and remembered him and aches for him. She remembers him enough to be absolutely crushed about it, but also Picard only had that one picture with Thad. It said that they met twice, more or less. Maybe I am misinterpreting that scene with Deanna, but it seemed to me like they had not seen him in a long time. And it wasn't just Riker being surprised that Picard had arrived without calling first. It seemed more so that Riker was surprised to see his old friend at all. I very much got the sense that they had not seen each other in a while at all. And I think that that's very similar to how Rios is approaching things, but from opposite sides. So Rios doesn't want to get attached to any more captains, and Picard doesn't want to get attached to a new crew. Indeed, when he started out, he just planned on going with Rios. Just the one dude. He didn't even have a full crew. He was surprised that Rafi was there. Rafi tagged along so she could go see her son. Agnes tagged along because Commodore O convinced her that she needed to murder Bruce Maddox. And then they picked up Soji on the way. And they picked up Elnor. And 7 of 9 ran into them at a certain point too. So he was not ever intending to have a crew necessarily for this. And he really thought that perhaps it would just be an escort mission initially when he asked Admiral Clancy for a ship to go out and retrieve Soji and come back. So for Picard, this is kind of an accidental family that he's forming. And I love accidental families and ragtag families in sci-fi, you guys. And also just in speculative fiction in general. Found family is one of my favorite tropes. It's one of my favorite things about Stargate SG-1. And I also love how these characters are really getting to know each other in Picard, particularly in this episode, as they are exploring their individual damage and baggage and seeing that overall we might think that we have to suffer alone with this type of thing and to carry and harbor these terrible secrets and thoughts, but that at the end of the day, we are not alone. 7 of 9 is a childless mother, the same way that Rafi is right now. And we also have Soji without parents and knowing who she is, looking for her humanity, like Picard and like Seven and like so many of these characters who've had to do these awful things over the years. And Rafi is trying to find her humanity because she feels, I think in many ways, that she's lost it. She lost who she was when she lost her job at Starfleet by backing Picard. And there are just so many layers in this show of these characters being juxtaposed with very similar problems, but dealing with them in very different ways, that it is narratively quite poetic in a way that George Lucas would definitely envy. It is far more poetic, I think, than how the last Star Wars trilogy turned out. And I know, I'm comparing Star Trek to Star Wars right now, and that is like comparing a space opera fantasy to a sci-fi, because that is exactly what it is. I was going to say apples and oranges, but they're only both fruit insofar as they are both kind of speculative fiction. That's about it. And they take place in space. But I digress. George Lucas just really says that he likes to think of Star Wars and their trilogies as being poetry, that they have kind of a rhyming scheme. And that is why they all end in similar ways and they have very similar themes. Don't get me wrong, I did really love The Rise of Skywalker, but overall, it did not have as great of a rhyming scheme throughout that trilogy as, for me, Star Trek Picard has so far. So as this episode ends, we are really about to find out where all of these people are coming from and also where they're going and how these experiences have shaped who they are individually, but also who they're going to be to each other going forward, how they're going to interact and react to each other as they all inevitably make more mistakes and more secrets and lies potentially come out as the La Sirena crew with Picard head to Soji's homeworld. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.